So welcome. I'm Shazia Dyer. I'm a council member for Bristol Law Society. It's my pleasure to introduce our panel today, who will be giving us an introduction to environmental, social and governance. We are recording this session. If you don't want to be recorded, then please just turn your camera off. We're very fortunate in that we have Professor Lee, Head of Law School, who will be telling us about development of ESG, and Tom Venables of Landmark Information Group, who will talk to us about a platform that Landmark have to help in the assessment of ESG. We will then move on to a question and answer session. The presentations will take approximately half an hour. We'll then have a question and answer session. If you could put any questions in the chat, then we'll take those at the end as well. But we have, I think, half a dozen other questions that have been submitted beforehand, and obviously we'll put those to the panel and then we can all share in that discussion. So we have Tim, Clare of Anthesis Group as well, and Simon Tilling of Burges Salmon, who will also assist in that panel discussion. So without further ado, Professor Lee, would you like to start the session off for us, please?
Very much, and good afternoon, everyone. In my paper this morning, I read of a green pension initiative. Didn't give that much detail, but it seems to be an initiative that will try and ensure that major pension investment will map on to a net zero carbon investment strategy. Just the latest in a long line, really, of initiatives in this ESG space. And for those of you not familiar with that space, we're using ESG as an acronym for environmental, social, and governance issues. And governance in this case being, of course, corporate governance. Now, these are really quite broad categories, but they're attempting to reflect those areas that are of interest to socially responsible investors. And actually there's no magic in terms of what goes into these pots of environmental, social and governance. It's whatever is considered important to that investment community who are trying to reflect their values and concerns, such as environmental concerns, when selecting investments. And of course, one feature of this is that we are talking there about investment strategies which are looking increasingly long-term rather than short-term. And I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. I've been a law professor now for a number of years, and it's quite interesting watching different generations of students come through the school. And actually, I think one of the things that's starting to happen is that the millennials, the students that I would have had as law students, you know, at the turn of the millennium, and, you know, for certainly 10, maybe 15 years thereafter, a lot of these people are now coming through into quite significant posts in their own organization. And I think that the work that they're doing reflects their values and attitudes. And in a Morgan Stanley survey of millennials, it found that 90% of millennial investors would pursue their investments according to ESG criteria. So what I think in part has happened really is that we have had this shift in view, such that, you know, by 2018, it was reckoned that $12 trillion globally were invested specifically in terms of ESG funds. And that's not to include all sorts of other investment that might have taken quite sensibly ESG criteria into account. Between 2001 and 2011, I headed up a national research centre, an ESRC, Economic and Social Research Council research centre, on business relationships, accountability, sustainability, and society, which look very directly at the attitudes of business to sustainability and to corporate social responsibility issues. And it was really well timed, because it timed, as other people on the panel will tell you, with this great switch to ESG thinking. But it's far outpaced anything that I could ever imagine, I think. And if you look now at mainstream finance, if you look at, for example, exchange traded funds, and the big investment houses like BlackRock would be a good example, they're now offering clients a whole range, a whole sort of buffet full of ESG offerings. I mean, I counted in that organization 6 new ESG funds last year. And when you look across these organizations, they increasingly have people with titles such as Head of Sustainable Investment, for example. And it's driven not just by that market activity, but it is driven by regulatory activity as well. So, you know, people at the moment across Europe are trying to get to grips with the sustainable finance disclosure regulations from the European Union, requiring financial reporting on not just the portfolios invested, but on the entities themselves, and asking increasingly for transparency in the methodology that these firms are using to drive their investments. What data are they relying on? And you know, that regulatory driver, of course, in turn has a knock-on impact in what it is that companies do. I mean, if companies know that the investors are going to be reporting themselves on what criteria they use, then of course the companies, unsurprisingly, in the annual reporting and elsewhere in their reporting structures, try themselves to state what it is that's important for them in the ESG agenda. And elsewhere in Europe, that's supported by things like the environmental taxonomy, climate change benchmarking. So, you know, we increasingly have an infrastructure here that is beginning to offer some shape to ESG criteria, which I will talk about in a moment. And it's a big move away from traditional thinking about investment. It's a big move away from a previous generation of investment, which really followed neoclassical economic lines and really sought to value a company on its financial value and its bottom line at a moment in time. And it's moved away from that to become much wider in terms of the criteria, and also, I think, much longer term in its outlook. Now, why should that be so? Why should we make this shift away from previous economic thinking? Well, I think for me, there are certainly 2 easy factors. One will be the financial crash of 2007 and 2008. And in the years of boom in 2005, 2006, and so on, you know, a lot of people began to get worried that the economy was overheating. But, you know, a response to that by a lot of economists was to point to market activity, to say that, you know, if you're worried about the pricing of collateral debt obligations, why? You know, because the price that people are purchasing these derivative instruments at is simply reflective of their market value. It's a functional market, so why should we worry that it's a false market? But in fact, we see that it was. We see that it truly was overheated, that these CDOs had been recycled any number of times and were so highly geared that they were completely unsustainable. So I think that, you know, produced a big change in attitude. And then, you know, another thing that I take at the moment is the whole idea of net zero targets. And, you know, as we run up to COP26 later this year, you know, we see more and more nation states coming out with increasingly ambitious targets for when they will move into net zero. And of course, if we know that, then we know that it will bring considerable disruption. I don't use disruption necessarily in a derogatory way, but market disruption, major change. And, you know, we now have to ask ourselves with the foresight that net zero gives, if nations are going to deliver on that agenda, am I going to invest, for example, in hydrocarbon-based energy? What happens if a lot of the people have been traditionally, you know, the base layer of investment for companies, the Exxons of this world, might be left with stranded investments? So you know, I think there's a rationality about what's going on here. Let me just talk about ESG criteria. So there are three pillars here: environmental, social, corporate governance. But they themselves break down into a whole host of other factors, other elements below those major headings. And as I say, there's no magic to what these are. They're simply things that reflect the values of the investment community, or are seen to be adding to the agenda for sustainable development. Because, for example, if you caught the conversation as you came into the room, you know, they're being seen to have some resilience to corporate capacity to withstand shocks like the pandemic. And some of these criteria might seem fairly woolly because they're fairly subjective. You know, what is it that matters to the investment community? That's a somewhat subjective issue. But it doesn't mean that we can't come up with objective criteria that lies below that. So if I ask how diverse your workforce is, or how diverse your board composition is, then we actually can reduce that to fairly simple metrics that we can then use as a basis for assessment. And because that's true, and Tom will talk following me about those sorts of criteria and how they can be used. But once we can build in those sorts of criteria, frankly, greenwash ceases to work. It's not about how clever your PR people write the annual report. We can bring some transparency through these tools, and indeed regulators, as I say, are demanding that transparency and are demanding mechanisms that we can use to look behind those claims. So if I just break down these criteria and talk about them in turn, if we talk about environmental and environmental criteria, then, you know, there are very obvious things to include there. So we might look at a firm's own energy mix. We might look at what percentage of that energy consumption by an organization is from renewable energy sources. We would look at waste management and how near that company manages to get to zero waste itself. Because waste is unwanted surplus, it's lost profit. And there's a logic to looking at that sort of issue. We would look at operational pollution because increasingly under this ESG accounting, we're not just looking at the corporate bottom line, we are interested in externalities. Some of those externalities like pollution may be negative externalities. Other ones, especially some of the ones in the social agenda, might be positive externalities. They might be free available benefit to wider communities. And then depending on the sector that we look at, we might look at different criteria. So I'm doing a lot of work at the moment because of a research project that I've got on the circular economy with the metals sector. And there we might look at issues like deforestation or biodiversity loss. But for service firms like law firms, we would substitute other criteria. So we might look at the greenhouse gas footprint of that firm, for example, in terms of air miles traveled, or we might look at the real estate management practices of the firm and you know how green their estate management is. And always we will be looking at some degree of supply chain scrutiny and how responsible, for example, sourcing of raw materials or labour, for that matter, might be. Just moving on to the social criteria, then if I just take an example of this, the social criteria is always concerned with relationships between the company and a series of stakeholders. If we take employees as stakeholders, just to give you some example, then we will be interested in employee remuneration, and we might be interested in how that employee remuneration in general maps on and compares to executive remuneration within the company. And within that space, we might be interested in things like the gender pay gap or the pension provisions made by the company. But it's not all about pay. Equally, we might be concerned with just how well that company looks after the wider well-being of its employees. We will be concerned about diversity, inclusion, prevention of sexual harassment, of management style, of the capacity for employees to influence decision-making within the company, training, education, skills building. You know, the company will pay, if it's a sizable company, an apprenticeship levy. Does it simply regard that levy as a tax, or does it have its own apprenticeship schemes? These things can matter. Staff turnover, yeah? Quite a measurable criteria of perhaps employee satisfaction. And we can do that across the whole other range of stakeholders. We can do it with the communities in which the company is located. We can do it with its charitable and pro bono performance. We can do it, of course, with its customer and its client relationships. And then the final criteria, and I'll stop with this, governance. Yeah. What about the corporate governance? The executive is charged with overseeing those employee and those other wider stakeholder and environmental interests. How well does it serve that agenda? And can we build around that agenda in thinking about executive remuneration? So to what extent does executive remuneration depend, for example, on customer and client satisfaction? So we can build reward structures that reflect ESG criteria, and that's actually increasingly important to investors, and it makes a lot of sense for investors. Investors aren't worried as such about the size of the remuneration package. What they are worried about is that executives are being rewarded for the long-term value that they add to the business, so that those reward structures themselves ought to be reflecting the issues that are of concern to the investment community. And then, of course, when we get to financial accounting, we need transparency. We need information that is full and frank and crucial to investment decision making. And as I said earlier, that accounting may not just be accounting in terms of bottom line accounting, but can be accounting for ESG performance and the externalities that I talked about. And if I just give you an example of how that governance end, that governance pillar feeds across elsewhere, think about boardroom diversity and think about how important that could be, because actually it's guarding against narrow or conflicted interests that may not do the business very good. All the talk about sleaze at the moment, you can see that case, that gender and ethnicity and different views at board level can really feed across quite well in ensuring that there's not some cozy and a somewhat questionable way of doing business. And really what we're talking about here is well known within company law for generations. We are talking about a fiduciary duty to run the company well. And you know, when I look back, it's not that much of this criteria has necessarily changed. I mean, you know, working in a large law firm environment myself in the 80s and 90s, of course we would have looked at, in a due diligence exercise, you know, the pension performance of the company. Of course we would have looked at its real estate. Of course we would have looked at its employee relations. But I think what has changed here is that we have added greatly to that criteria, but we have really changed our lens. And we've really changed our lens because we've come to see that what is important is not so narrowly drawn around shareholder interest, but reflects issues that are important to us all, and certainly to a much wider range of stakeholders than used to be reflected. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. That was very informative. And first time I've heard the term greenwashing. We'll use that. Lovely. So next speaker we've got is Tom Venables. Tom, would you like to do your presentation?
Yeah, thanks very much. That was a great start. Thanks, Bob. I think before I dive into the slides, am I right in thinking that there's a poll that's about to go out to the delegates? I think that's just going to kick off. There we go. So I'll start to share my screen and then I'll go into my presentation. So hopefully that has brought up my slides. Should say ESG management, yes. Screening reports, Risk Horizon, perfect. Great, okay. Just move this out of the way. Wonderful, wonderful. So yeah, I'm just going to spend the next sort of 10-15 minutes or so just talking through our Risk Horizon ESG screening report. So this is something that we launched at the back end of last year. And yeah, traditionally, I guess some of you might be familiar with Landmark as a provider of environmental and property information and data and reporting in the UK. But this kind of expansion into ESG is something it's quite new to the business. As I said, we've worked closely with Anthesis in developing the reporting platform that I'll show you later on in the session. And essentially, yeah, the Risk Horizon ESG screening report aligns quite nicely with other screening level assessments that Landmark offers in those spaces for environmental and flood risk. So the key kind of things to highlight for the Risk Horizon report are it surfaces key risks, provides a starting point for assessing ESG risk. It is a data-driven ESG assessment with a consultant, with consultant input as well. And that consultant will highlight the kind of main headlines from an ESG perspective. It provides a company-specific and quick turnaround top-level view of risk, and that's based on a profile by looking at industries and geographies. And again, I'll come on to that in the next few slides. And then the kind of final key part of the report is the generation of kind of next steps and recommendations by risk topic outcome. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the data that sits behind the Risk Horizon report. So the main kind of ones just to kind of outline is SASB, so the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which some of you may or may not be familiar with. But essentially, they're one of the major global sustainability standards organizations. Another one just to kind of mention would be the GRI, which you might be familiar with as well. But SASB have developed 77 industry standards that map out the key material ESG risks for a specific industry. And they've done that through the creation of what they've kind of termed a materiality map, which basically, yeah, for those 77 industries, they've identified the key risks in terms of materiality for those particular industries. So that's been based on extensive research. I think they launched in late 2018, but correct me if I'm wrong here, Tim, later on. But I think it was based on 5 to 6 years worth of research with businesses and investors. And that, again, the focus is on financial materiality, so looking at materiality through that investment lens. So the scope of other issues that the report covers are aligned with the International Finance Corporation performance standards, the Equator Principles, the GRI, as I just mentioned, and of course SASB. The other things just to highlight in terms of the data sets that sit behind the platform, and of course the reports, are some of the data providers that we utilize. So there's a range there on the slide. So for water stress, we use the Aqueduct WRI data set. UNICEF, we tap into their child labour data set. We've got quite a few data sets from the World Bank, and then Transparency International as well for corruption and business ethics. So there's quite a good spread of sort of renowned data providers and sources there. So in terms of how Risk Horizon can help legal professionals, so really it's suited to help any lawyer involved in M&A activity, private equity advisory, or other corporate related activities. Those could all be sort of benefit from a Risk Horizon screening report. And basically it's suitable to kick off early stage diligence work to support analysis either for target companies, whether that be for hostile takeovers or any other context, or for any clients that want a company specific sort of first look at potential ESG risks. Again, it's especially helpful for lawyers that might have expertise or knowledge in a specific area. So whether that's within environmental, things like contaminated land, or kind of general environmental issues, the Risk Horizon report can help plug these gaps and cover areas where knowledge or expertise for either social or governance issues might not be as detailed. So I just want to highlight this slide here, which really is a slide to illustrate the benefits of Risk Horizon. So looking at a specific industry, on the slide you'll see a range of ESG issues that might be relevant to any given company. On the face of it could be quite overwhelming. So there's 40, 50 odd risk topics there. And specifically looking at the metals and mining industry, if we just move this forward, hopefully the transition comes through. By ordering a Risk Horizon report or using the platform, you can surface the key material risks to that particular industry. So for metals and mining, we're looking at a host of environmental issues there, which is obviously, as you'd expect, quite weighted in that area, but also a number of social and governance issues as well, ranging from labour practices, health and safety, to business ethics and supply chain management. So for the next part of the presentation, I'm actually going to take you through the platform itself in terms of how a consultant would build an ESG screening report. So I'm just going to access the platform now.
Yeah, we can see company assessment.
Perfect. So this is the kind of one I prepared earlier, to quote Blue Peter. This is the kind of first stage of filling out a company assessment, so the Risk Horizon screening report. As I said, this is one that I've looked at, and sticking with the theme of metals and mining, I produced a sample report on Rio Tinto, so the mining multinational conglomerate that are based or have global operations headquartered in the UK. So the details here, the key details section is just information that I've input into the system. Again, it's not material to the outcome of the assessment, but this is information that will be pulled through to the PDF report. So I'll just take you through to the next stage of the assessment, which is where we start to look at and engage with the data. So this is using the SASB industry profiles along with the data sets that sit behind the country scores. So I'll just briefly talk about the industries. So you can select up to 4 industries from this drop-down bar here, and basically you're profiling your specific company that you're running the assessment on to one of these industries. So for Rio Tinto, it's quite straightforward. We're looking at the metals and mining industry. But if there was a business that you were looking at which maybe had different segments and different activities, then you could actually add up to 4 separate industries in against that company. And by adding the metals and mining industry standard in, we're surfacing those key material risks. So that will look quite similar to the slide that I showed you previously. So we're seeing the environmental issues in green, the social issues in red, and the blue are the governance issues. So that kind of frames and highlights the material risks sort of straight off the bat. And the second part of the company footprint is to add in our operating locations. Again, this is all information that I've just done from research analysis of Rio Tinto using their website and publicly available sources. So I've actually identified their operating locations and added those in again to the platform. And by doing that, we can actually start to build a picture of not just inherent risk, which I'll talk about in just a second, but also looking at individual country scores and scores sort of for the industry in terms of how material those particular risk topics are and how they're scored by SASB. So that's what we're looking at now. So we're looking at the various risk factors for the metals and mining industry and how material those particular risk factors are within the industry. So we've got a range of scores here between 0 and 10. So I'll just explain the scoring, which 0 to 2 is very low, 2 to 4 is low, 4 to 6 is moderate, 6 to 8 is high, and then 8 to 10 is extreme. So this is looking at the industry, and we've got some high ratings for air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, hazardous materials, health and safety, waste management, wastewater and effluent, and that all kind of tallies up with what you'd expect. So a number of significant environmental material risks there. Just briefly scrolling down, what we're seeing here is a summary of the top 5 at-risk countries. And what we're able to do is cross-reference the industry data by looking at those data sets that sit behind the platform. So, you know, from providers such as Transparency International, UNICEF, the WRI, all those data sets feed in to provide a geographic score for the country in terms of how that country is performing for that particular risk topic. So we're seeing the kind of the top 5 at-risk countries here. So we're seeing a lot of extremes and high risks in terms of that scoring. So our most at-risk countries are Oman, Mongolia, Mozambique, China, and Madagascar. And all this information, again, is pulled through to the PDF report, which I'll briefly run through as well. So that's the kind of footprint section of the assessment that a consultant will complete. And then moving along to the kind of management questions and information review. The platform also surfaces specific questions relating to that particular industry. So you're seeing industry-related management questions, and that's what we're seeing here on this this page. So as a consultant, they would review information from the company website to populate the answers to these questions. Again, there could be a use case where if you had access to a data room, you could also utilize that to kind of input answers and get an accurate sort of take on these questions. But for kind of well-established publicly traded companies, such as Rio Tinto, there's a host of information and disclosures that you can actually use to kind of answer these questions. And again, it takes a similar approach. So you've got your environmental questions, your social questions, and your governance questions. And it's really just highlighting the top risks here are the ones that are shown in pink. So yeah, questions relating to those top 5 risk factors, and then answers to those questions based on the research and analysis that a consultant has done. I'll just quickly call out as well. So as we're going through, we're going to basically capture our references and input these as well. So we've got our sources of information that we can refer to. And again, that's also pulled through to the PDF report. So the final sort of section of producing a screening report is the recommendations section. And again, this is driven by what we've selected earlier on in the process. So we're highlighting the top issues for further consideration. So for the countries that we're looking at and the industry, air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, hazardous materials, health and safety, and wastewater and effluent have been deemed the most material risk factors for this assessment. So basically, this generates a set of recommendations or actions. And again, that information is then, we have the ability to edit that based on any analysis and research, and this will be pulled through to the PDF report, which will be sent on to to our law firm clients. So just to minimize that, I'll now bring up the PDF report. So this is the kind of output of the platform. Hopefully everyone can see that. It should say Rio Tinto moderate risk. And this is essentially, the output of that platform process. So the consultants completed the assessment, and this is what the end product will look like. So a summary of those key risks are presented on the front page. We've got our key details here, defining the company description and the activities. And we're highlighting, as I said, those combined key impacts. So those risk topics that are deemed most material for this particular business, and then those countries of operation in terms of the top 5 countries at risk. I'll just briefly run through. So we've got our recommendations again towards the front of the report, which kind of highlight where to go next and the information that you need to seek for each of those risk topics. We have a report detail page, which highlights and visually presents the operating locations on the map. There's also 2 additional data sets that sit within the report, which cover countries that have sanctions against them. And also we have a pandemic preparedness data set as well. So that's just an addition that goes into the report and highlights those countries that are relevant that we've included. We get some information based on the SASB standard, so the metals and mining standard. And then into the risk assessment, we see the scoring. So it's all kind of carried through to the PDF report, including our risk matrix as well, which has the full set of scores for all the countries, not just the top 5. So all the countries of operation for Rio Tinto are covered here. And then onto the information review. So this is our management questions that I walked you through. The answers are populated in the report here. And again, just highlighting those relating to those top 5 risk factors. And then onto the references, and then just the methodology and summaries of the risk topics that are covered. So that's essentially that's the platform and the report. So in conclusion, just the closing sort of points on the Risk Horizon report. So it can be requested just simply by providing a company name. It's not just limited to publicly traded companies. If there's a private company, we can still go through the same process to profile that particular business against the standards and generate those questions. So our team will find the key details based on that company name, identify those operating locations, and profile, as I said, that particular business using one of the industry standards, and then run through the tool as I just showed you, and then we'll produce the kind of PDF output report, which discloses the ESG risks for the company, along with any findings from a keyword search that a consultant has carried out by identifying additional material issues such as data breaches, pollution incidents, and then we can create our headlines for that for ESG risk for that particular company. And that's
Thank you very much, Tom. A very comprehensive system. Okay, so now we have a Q&A session. So I'll ask Tim, Clare and Simon Tilling to join the panel in this. If I just put the first question to all of you, and whoever's best placed to answer it, please chip in as necessary. So what do you think are the top 5 risks for lawyers advising on ESG matters? Any takers?
Shall I? Sorry, Tim's also come off mute at the same time.
Yeah, you go.
Thanks, Tim. There's a number of ways of interpreting that question. Typical lawyers' response to the question. Thank you for it. It's a really good one. There's risk to lawyers in starting to get involved in ESG. There's risks that lawyers, or ESG risks, ESG factors that lawyers should be looking out for. And I might just answer or give a couple of opening thoughts on both of those, actually, just to start the debate going. I'm going to start from my perspective as an environmental lawyer. So I clearly don't. Probably worth starting with my role in the firm. I head up the environmental law team, but I'm also leading on ESG. That's across right across the firm. We've got colleagues in pensions and funds who are advising on the sustainable finance angle. We've got colleagues in business crime and modern slavery, and we've got colleagues working across the governance and reporting side in corporate. So there's lots of people in the firm that are involved in this project, because as Bob said so clearly at the start, there's a huge range of factors. There's no definitive list of ESG factors. It depends what the investors are looking at. It depends what sector the clients are in. It depends on a lot of different different issues. And I think there's a lawyer's tendency to put everything in a nice box and to say, this is my area of expertise, I've got this. And for me, my area of expertise is environmental law, which itself is pretty broad and challenging to keep abreast of all of it. So you can't cover everything. So I think to answer the question, risks inherent to lawyers getting involved in ESG, I think the biggest risk, or the biggest mistake really, is to expect you can cover the whole spectrum, which is exactly why tools like the landmark tool and all of Anthesis's great work developing that, to try and map that out and to color code. And just to use that Rio Tinto example, which Tom didn't set up purposely for me, but actually as a result of that came out with a number of environmental factors, which would be exactly the point where if I was looking at that report, I could say, okay, here's some of the issues. There's some health and safety issues in here. Here's health and safety colleagues. There's a number of air quality issues. That would be areas of my experience. So actually these tools that are available to us that the consultants pull together for the lawyers help this become manageable to lawyers who are advising and protecting our clients about risks. So I think on that side of things, that's my answer. I'll just have one line on the other side, which is clearly the ESG risks that are the biggest risks to the corporates that we're advising, or to the investments that might be being put forward. Again, that depends on the on a range of factors, but as an environmental lawyer, I think climate change and the biodiversity crisis are so significant in terms of risk, and they will drive a transition which will create that disruption that Bob was talking about, that they absolutely, we as lawyers just need to be understanding this is a transition economy. Things are changing. We need to understand that. We need to help our clients on that journey, and that's exactly where these tools come in to support us. So that's my opening comments on that.
Thank you, Simon. Tim, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'm always pleased to come after Simon because he always sounds better than me if I go first. So first thing, I just reiterate Simon's point. ESG is so broad, and I mean typically we would say, and if you follow, for instance, UNPRI guidance, you can categorize things into 40 broad categories across the 3 areas, but then you can subdivide those into a myriad of different ways. And so it is really, really broad. A sustainability ESG consultancy like us can't handle every area, and some areas sort of outgrow the ESG cradle, I suppose. So cybersecurity was and is an ESG issue, but it's now an issue of its own size. And if you were working on a deal, it has its own people who look after that, and it's best to exclude it. So it is really broad. You can't handle everything, but there's lots you can handle, and it's about being honest about what you can't. And so coming as this from an advisor, I'm conscious that, for instance, there's a lot of ESG that is legal and sort of far more direct, solid legal work, rather than it being policy work or the sort of regulatory work that I would deal with from a compliance perspective. And so that's the time we turn around and say, you really need to speak to your lawyers about this. But there will be other advisors in the mix that you would point to and get in and suggest that they get involved. But I think the two things I really would want to get over is, one is to sort of remember ESG is really about performance improvement, it's not about compliance. Compliance is a really big part of it, but the end results of most ESG strategies now are around trying to boost diversity, reduce carbon impact, reduce climate change impact, which is a slightly separate thing, which is as big, ensure ethics are improved. And whilst there might be bits of law helping that along, and we're really lucky in the UK that certain regulatory pushes, such as, for instance, gender pay gap reporting, has pushed us advanced beyond quite a few of the other European countries, for instance. A lot of it is actually, it's non-legal, and it's about trying to advance performance, and you've just got to encourage that behavior and not allow it to become a purely legal discussion. And it's also very firmly, and this part of it is really, really taking over now, it's about opportunity as much as it is about risk. And if you arrive and just see it as a risk discussion, and particularly if you're pitching, there's a good chance you might not win the work, because people are arriving now into this ESG agenda thinking, how do I make my money out of this? And so you have to be on board on that side.
Thank you. Tom, there was a question about the platform, the Risk Horizon tool. It says, does it search for or highlight reputational or brand damaging issues such as litigation, negative publicity or media coverage?
So that's something we would do as a consultant completing the report for a client. We would carry out some keyword searches to try and capture that information, where possible.
Excellent. Robert, you've come off mute. I'm assuming you want to add something to the debate?
Well, it's such an obvious thing that I'm a bit hesitant to say it, but stay close to the client. I mean, client instruction is really important. I mean, the people instructing you will have, as Tim says, it's not all about risk, but they will have very different risk appetites, depending on their background. Private equity investment is very different from dealing with trade transaction, for example. And because, as Simon says, there is no definitive agenda here, there may always be things that your particular client has a really strong interest in. And I think it's really important in initial instructions to really delve down into quite what those issues are. I think one advantage of Risk Horizon in this respect is that if you're commissioning that report from Tom really early on, you can go into those key meetings with already quite a lot of background behind you.
Simon?
Yeah, just to add to what Bob says and to wholeheartedly agree. Actually, ESG is one of the really great opportunities to talk to a client about what is bothering them, what is troubling them. On the back of a report, you've got a nice color-coded report that gives that some tangibility, so it makes that conversation much easier for those that are new to ESG. But it's exactly as Bob says about keeping close to the client. And often, actually, I start the conversation, we will have a number of ESG factors down on a piece of paper, and I'll say, well, what's bothering you? What's keeping you awake at night? What's troubling you? And that just leads to conversations which are which sometimes aren't legal conversations, but they're great conversations to have with the client. And some of it will be consultancy driven. Some of them will be out and out legal conversations, especially for those of us lawyers whose contacts are in-house lawyers, GCs, who are, their job in the company is to protect their clients, to advise their clients, and to watch out for these reputational and legal risks that are coming down the road. So it's just a really good opportunity for a conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. The next question is, how should a law firm go about setting up its own ESG policies?
If I kick off as the non-lawyer, I think that the first thing it needs to do, but I'd be saying this to any firm, not just a law firm, is to do two things. Is firstly decide why it wants to do it and what's its drivers for doing so, because those drivers will help you start to lay out the depth you're going to go to. And the first time I use this word, help you start setting your ambition. And these things overlap, but the second thing you need to think through is what is the firm's broader ambition? And as I say, this is connected to the why. So in doing it, let's take climate change. You know, is your ambition to actually allow to do this in order to make sure your firm really takes a leading role in managing its carbon emissions, its GHG emissions? Or on diversity, does it want to be a leader in this space and really push to be an organization that is blind during recruitment, blind during staff development, and allows everyone to get on equally? So the first point is understand why you're doing it and the level of ambition, and then you can start to plan this out. And as part of that front end process, I think you need to actually just take a step back and look at a lot of the arrangements and frameworks that are out there and decide what you want to align with. And then that will allow you to progress. I'll let some of the other delegates speak to this, but I mean, I think where law firms are quite lucky, particularly in the UK, is there's more of a sort of a consensus movement building around what is the best way of doing this. And I think that's an increasingly important part, is understanding what seems to be best practice forming amongst the practices and the initiatives to join in on.
Yeah, sharing good practice is always a really good way of finding the gaps and how to do things. Shall we, Robert, you've got...
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is that this cannot be a top-down exercise. Yeah, it's not about the firm's partners or leaders saying, this is where we're going. Yeah. If you're working in any sort of decent organization, you have a lot of quite buzzy people who are going to already be engaged with all of the agendas that we've been talking about. And in terms of both strategizing and operationalizing all of this, you've got to surrender ownership of this, you know, and you've got to let your teams mobilize around this agenda.
Yeah.
Simon?
Completely agree. From my perspective, I'm the client-facing part of ESG. We've got a whole team at Burges Salmon who are actually delivering the what we're doing as a law firm side of it. So I'm not close to the detail, but I can, you know, I see the output of that, which is excellent, and we do have a really good team looking at it. Why are we doing it? We're not after private equity investment. We're a law firm owned by the partners. We're doing this firstly because our clients expect it, and if we're going to put ourselves out as one of the leaders in the net zero transition, one of the leading environmental law firms, etc., we need the clients expect us to be doing it. But we're doing it very much. We're doing it because it's the right thing, obviously, as partners and owners of the business. But as Bob says, there's so much energy in our juniors, in our trainees, in our support staff, certainly, absolutely with the younger members, that they've really embraced it. And a lot of the change comes from our Be Sustainable community, which is anybody who wants to be involved from right across the firm, driving it. And actually, it's such a boon on recruitment, because we are really trying to set something of a pace here, and it's an attraction for on a recruitment side too. So there's lots of really good drivers outside of simply being doing ESG because you're after investment from private equity or others.
Yeah, no, you have to embrace that energy. Tim?
I'll just come back in. Simon's hit on some really good points there. One of the really important things is to find out, in this part of this discovery session, and finding out what the firm wants to do and why it's doing it and what the ambition is. One of the really crucial things is also to find out what is important to staff. So and we've, as a firm that helps people build out their strategies, I think we've gone on a journey of realizing how broad you need to make that, because you need, for for any system to be successful, you need engagement, and you need people to be bought in. So it has to be interesting. It has to be, I hate using the word exciting, but potentially exciting, etc., etc. People got to want to get involved. And when we first started out, and we started a lot of our work working with private equity and building their ESG systems and frameworks and policies, and their driver was, give me one that ticks all the boxes for anyone arriving and looking at us, armed with the UNPRI's LP due diligence questionnaire. So we would build perfect systems that anyone coming along with that checklist of 20 questions, do you do ESG screening? Tick. Do you do ESG due diligence? Tick. Do you do this? Perfect. But it was laborious, and it was boring, and it was uninspiring. And sometimes it's important just to make sure you focus back on what people are engaged in, and then that gets buy-in and that gets staff involved. And traditionally, when you reach out to staff, you will find it's climate change. You will find it's diversity, but you might find the diversity's got a different angle, for instance. So when you reach out there, you might find that it's as much around people wanting to make sure the firm's diversity policy gives more of a chance to people from the wrong side of the tracks, irrespective of ethnicity, gender, etc., and things like that. So the more you reach out, the more you understand what's important to the staff, the more engagement you get, and the more successful the end product will be.
That makes good sense. Okay. We have a question now on embedding and adopting ESG and ESG framework. What advice would you give people when looking at this in terms of overcoming challenges to enable us to embed those frameworks? What tools are there available to help overcome the challenges?
If I kick off again, I think to an extent we've actually covered some of the key points there around some of the important things to take on board in that last section.
Yeah.
The starter for 10 is framing it right, understanding what people want, as Bob started talking to it, ensuring that it's owned by everyone. It's owned by the leadership, but it's also owned by the staff, and make things really simple and easy to do. ESG systems and setups do not have to be laborious in a sort of ISO certified management system type way. And in theory, there's no reason that an ISO system should be laborious anymore either. But it shouldn't be like, these should be light touch, they should be directed. And there are various frameworks out there that will help you along the way and guide you. And in some respects, actually they can be laborious, but that's part of ensuring that there is a certain element of transparency and standardization to how you report. And so that can be essential. Tools wise, there are different things for different places along here. And, ESG is broad enough that it also includes things like making sure your HR system is spot on, because within this, you need good metrics, and you're going to need good metrics around diversity, around staff turnover, around training hours. All these are classic ESG metrics. So those have to be in place before you can do that. But then also, if you're in an investment firm, due diligence is going to be a key part of things. So tools such as Risk Horizon are the sort of things you also need to think about.
Thank you. Robert?
So just a comment on Tim's, idea of some sort of rather laborious standard that one wishes to meet. I mean, it can be frustrating, I think, dealing with this agenda when, as Simon said earlier, there is no definitive list. What I would say is rejoice. Rejoice that that definitive list is not there. Rejoice that there is no universal standard here for ESG, because it militates against any sort of tick box approach. And it allows you as a lawyer, therefore, to add real value to what you're doing for the client.
Thank you. Okay.
But if I just add on to Bob's point that he's absolutely right. But it's beware, because the push for standardization is continually coming. And the danger with that is standardization always runs the risk in this. When the field is so broad, the risk of actually missing the important factor in an organization gets stronger and stronger. So the push to try and reduce this, like we've seen with the sustainable finance disclosure regs, to 50 we want 30 metric points, now it's 15, is that 15 is too broad. And the danger of actually missing what's really important to an organization becomes stronger and stronger.
Mm. Yeah, I agree, and I just want to add. I mean, we're lawyers on this call, and I'm one. We like rigor. We don't mind a bit of laboriousness, but we do like to know we've caught everything, and we like a tick box to make sure we haven't missed something. And in this game, that's actually that can be counterproductive for all the reasons we've talked about. The objective here is to get better. There is no perfect, or at least I don't think we've got there yet. It's driving, it's maximising those opportunities, reducing the risks, and driving businesses into a more sustainable world. And so I think the legal tendency to try and box everything off actually can interfere with all that enthusiasm and energy that we've talked about being within the ranks, within the firms, everywhere else. So I think it's and within clients.
To a degree, but I think you have to leave enough agility within the system so that when you need to drill down, as long as you can highlight where the areas of concern are, it's like any risk register, so you then take a deeper dive as necessary.
Exactly, and that's where the layers of this with the landmark product and other products, the consultancies giving you the risk mapping, and then you as lawyers can get involved in the particular detail. That's what's really attractive about it.
Excellent. Okay, I know we have a colleague from Brazil that's joined us, so I'm assuming this has come from them. Can actual Brazilian environmental policy fend off international investors considering the ESG principles? Any suggestions? Tim?
Well, it's a really interesting day, actually, because I believe 40 British supermarkets and major food producers this morning wrote to the Brazilian government and stated that if the current proposed land laws, which would affect, as I understand it, would allow a certain proportion of the sort of converted rainforest land which has been misappropriated to fall into the legal ownership of those people who have started farming it. Those supermarkets have turned around and said, if you do that, we will stop sourcing from Brazil. There is a tendency at the moment for such initiatives to snowball. And a lot of these things start in the UK. So you could see how that would follow through. And if a certain proportion of the US retailers, and Walmart are actually really quite big on this sort of stuff, start getting into this as well, you'll see what's really been quite a strong element of ESG, which is market pressure drives the change. And from that point of view, you will see ESG sort of pushing and forcing some level of change in Brazil. And we have a small Brazilian part to our business, and I know they are busy and they are helping investors work with Brazilian organizations who are trying to ensure that those standards, sort of the international ESG standards, are applied in Brazil.
Excellent. So it's a timely question. Tom, you've come off mute. Have you got something to add?
And I was just going to follow up with what Tim was saying about the supermarket story. I read that as well, and
okay, I see.
That is pretty topical that's come up.
Very topical. Okay, if there's nothing more on that one, we've got our final question that we've accepted. How can business ensure accountability for ESG across their organisation? And I know you've talked about leaders being not being top down, but how do we make sure that people walk the walk, I suppose?
Well, it is, we always talk about walking the talk. Right? The starter for 10 is board suite accountability. So I'm going to be 4 o'clock this afternoon. I shall be laying into a C-suite as part of a diligence exercise, and the first part of my line of questioning is going to be around. So the questionnaire says the CEO is responsible. Is he? Who does he then delegate to? This has to be a C-suite issue, and that for me is the most important part of actually making it happen, is having that buy-in and it being really meaningful buy-in, not just lip service, and then it to be formalized into quite a few of the structures the management works to. So a formal element on the board agenda on a monthly basis, for there to be specific metrics in the board pack each month. And for me, that's one of that sort of element is really, really key, because unless it's on the agenda all the time, it's a little bit like it's an extension of the idea that every board meeting should start with health and safety. There are other ESG, it still should, because it's still keeping people alive. It's still the most important thing any organization needs to do. But then other ESG topics have to be on the agenda constantly. And that's the first part of making sure it trickles down everywhere.
Lovely. Anything from anybody else? No, I think that's really helpful. I saw today actually Bath and North East Somerset have just got a new cabinet in, and they've said climate emergency is a portfolio for one of their members, and no decisions will be taken unless that they've been signed off by them. So that's the key way, I think, is any decision making. Even I think we've talked about the soft powers as well. It's just making sure that it's embedded throughout the organisation, and you have things like performance indicators and employee job specs that have it as part of their duties, things like that. It all adds to the overall emphasis. Robert, did you have something to add?
Well, just to say, I think that at an academic level, I'm quite interested in what you might call private transnational regulation, which are those initiatives that come from the private sector, and which guide action taken by companies. Things like the Forestry Stewardship Council will be a good example. I mean, in the Brazil example, if Equator principal financial institutions decide that it might not help their reputation to be investing in Brazil, then you will see investment flows to Brazil begin to dry up. So that's what I'm interested in. And I'm interested in it because at the moment I have a grant from the UK government for a UK circular economy centre in technology metals. Now, technology metals are going to drive the green economy. And, if you take a standard thing, cobalt, which we desperately need for electric mobility, 2/3 of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it is sourced to a very large degree by child labour. Now, you may think, well, this is terrible and we should eliminate that. But it's a hugely difficult problem because the children involved are not working for Rio Tinto. The children involved are working for their family. They're working for their mother and father, helping source cobalt to put food on the table. And the organisations involved in my circular economy centre include people like Johnson Matthey and Rolls-Royce would be another example. I mean, they're terribly worried about responsible sourcing. And it's a really difficult thing to get on top of. But what you do see now in that metal sector are some leaders emerging from the private sector institutions. And once you see that begin to happen, it's quite interesting. You get leaders and you get laggards. And it makes sense for the leaders to put some space between themselves and the laggards. And it makes sense for those leaders to begin to promote ESG values, because actually it's feeding into a sort of virtuous circle. So yeah, I think in answer to the question, it's really quite important to look at what some of the private institutions within these particular sectors are doing in the ESG agenda, because there comes a point of in time at which it really makes sense for them to push this agenda and to try and create some competitive almost space as against the other firms in the area.
Lovely. Thank you very much, and thank you to all of our panel and those that submitted the questions for today. We will send the slides and the links around after the session later this week. If you have any questions that, once you've had a think about what you've heard today and you have any further questions, then our speakers are happy to take those. If you send them to Clare, she'll forward them. And then finally, I just wanted to hand over to Simon Boyle, who'd like to make a few concluding remarks. Simon.
Yes, thanks. I'm sure we all found that absolutely brilliant from Bob, Simon, Tim and Tom there. So how do we summarise what's gone on? It's hard to do that really in a couple of minutes, but I suppose some points that we picked up are that we are transitioning from how we used to run companies, how governments used to run. We're going into something new. We're not at the end of that transition yet. We're sort of probably at the start of the journey. Yes, it's happening with corporates, it's happening with investors, but it's happening in all walks of life. I mean, it's happening in agriculture, how we're moving from traditional sort of how farms are paid for the single farm payment to the environmental land management, which is all about public goods. Much more interest now in rewilding and boosting biodiversity. So it's happening in all walks of life. And why is it happening now that we're going through this transition? And I think there are three main reasons, I suppose. Climate change, which we've known about for many years, but and we've had all the COPs taking place, as you know, we're in COP26 this year, going for a long time, but now it's starting to really bite, where we are seeing things like the disappearance of the Arctic Ocean. So we're now being told that the Arctic is likely to be ice-free in the summer by 2050. So we are changing the planet. And then, of course, people like James Lovelock, Jim Lovelock have been talking about all the positive feedbacks that's going to or could well arise from there, like the permafrosts melting, releasing methane. So you get this positive feedbacks, and it's kind of uncontrollable climate change. But I think there's this realization now it is happening. All these things linked together. Then we've seen the massive loss of biodiversity over certainly our lifetimes when we look at how that's been so severely diminished. We've had probably nobody better than David Attenborough making so forcefully and brilliantly, what we're doing to the planet and how it has to change. So we are going through this sixth mass extinction now, and as he said, it's all about it's not about saving the planet; it's saving our civilizations. That's what's at stake. And then we've had, out of the blue, it would appear, although people like Bill Gates have been saying for a long time it's inevitable, the pandemic, and realizing that it's you're not, as a company, you're not operating in isolation. You're part of the bigger picture, whether you like it or not. Pandemic happens, probably a zoonotic disease, so it's how our relationship with the natural world has probably caused that, and everything that has followed that, it completely and utterly disruptive. We've never seen anything like it in our lifetime. So all these things coalescing together, realizing that we're in it together. We have to make changes. Businesses have to change. Investors have to change. We need to transition from, and we are transitioning fairly quickly now, from fossil fuels to renewables. But Bob made an excellent point at an earlier presentation I heard him speak at. We've got to be very careful we don't transition from fossil fuels to metals based. And you just talked about cobalt mining in the Congo by children. So we've got to be very careful how we go about all this. So we are through this. We are going through this process of transition. We don't know how it's going to end, but we have to play a part in it. Otherwise, it's pretty grim for us as a species, really, and so much of the natural world. So I think we're starting to do the right thing now. It's going to be with us forever. It's not something we're just going to do and sort out, and there we are. I mean, luckily we have got technology that is helping us along. I think we need a lot more in political leadership. We're starting to see that, of course. We've seen how President Trump looked at the environment. didn't pay a great deal of attention really. Thought climate change was probably just, you know, a nonsense. And now we're seeing what President Biden's doing. So we're seeing these massive changes are happening.
So that's really, yeah, that's a really great summary. So thank you very much, Simon. What I'd like to do is ask all the speakers to just stay on the line for 5 minutes, and if everyone else could leave. And thank you very much for attending today. Okay, so Claire.